Welcome to the Human Collab, a platform about people and their stories. You're listening to the second part of the two-part interview series with Devika Monik. Physical impairments do not equate to limitations in intelligence or capabilities. And yet, assumptions about the intellect of individuals with disabilities, including those with neurodiversity, are often misguided. In this part, we continue to understand from Devika about what it takes to break down barriers and advocate for a more inclusive world. We try to gain a perspective from Devika's personal experiences on the impact her disability has had on the relationships in her life. We also explore how society can better support individuals with disabilities through practical steps and societal changes. Additionally, we discuss the Wheeling Happiness Foundation and Devika's efforts to empower people while busting common myths to foster a more inclusive society. As a person with disability, when you were looking to date or get into a relationship, was the perspective or the worldview different, or how was the entire scenario like for you?
So, for me, fortunately, I think I have gravitated to people, whoever I have dated throughout the course of my life so far. My disability has never been a factor which has been an upfront reason for somebody to accept or reject to date me. But when I do date someone, I do, because like I said, my disability is not immediately visible, so I do make it very apparent and obvious to the other person, and I do explain to them what my limitations are with respect to my disability. And of course, if somebody continues to date me beyond that, it means that they are on board with that. But in this regard, I have always come across people who have been very accepting, and accepting not even in a way that it's not even a factor. This is never the reason why somebody would date me or not date me. So I guess I have kind of found the right kind of empathetic people who are empathetic or inclusive or just good human beings overall in their mindsets and their approach. And it goes the other way as well. My sister has dated people who have had disabilities through the course of her life. So because we have grown up in this environment, we don't look at it as a factor to include or eliminate somebody from the dating pool as such. And so even for me, I have never, if I have had a crush on someone or if I have liked someone, I have never had to stop and think that, oh, what if this person rejects me because of my disability? Because that is just not the line of thought that I have. And I think if somebody does feel that way, I would automatically not gravitate to a person like that.
I think I read somewhere that you studied sports psychology. Is that information correct?
No, I studied sports psychology very briefly. I essentially did my master's in clinical and organizational behavior, clinical psychology and organizational behavior.
And what was your motivation behind, pursuing this form of education that you did?
So I was personally, two things. One is that I started to get very interested in philosophy. And the second thing was that I was, of course, very inspired always by the resilience that my mother displayed in the way that she dealt with her disability and made something out of it. Because I always saw people, even, of course, people who are able-bodied would always say that, you are such an inspiration, and when we look at you and how you deal with your life, our small day-to-day hassles look so silly to us. But similarly, even other women with disabilities would approach her and ask her, when you can't even walk, when you can't even control your bladder or bowel, we are also in a similar situation, but somehow you are so active, so how do you do it? Please teach us as well. And then we would have these women coming in, living in our house for 1 week, 10 days, 2 weeks, just observing how my mother goes about her day-to-day life, what tips and tricks she uses to be more mobile, and they would learn from that and, take that away with them. So I was always very inspired by her resilience, and that also kind of, gave me this insight and interest into human psychology as to how, like, different people can deal with the same situation differently. So, and like, of course, like I said, I had an interest in philosophy, but everybody also always said that, like, that's not something that you can make a profession out of. So this combination of interest in philosophy as well as just how mental resilience works, which I observed in my mom, it made me want to study psychology a little more deeply. And even though I'm not a practicing professional psychologist now, in the sense that I don't take sessions where I, charge money from people, my education in psychology has helped me because we do now a lot of rehabilitative counseling for people who, especially people with acquired disabilities, because like I said, your entire life changes in an instant. And then, of course, one part of it that is that you have to relearn how to physically do your tasks with the limited mobility that you have. But you also have to, like, relearn your entire mental framework and have that mental acceptance of how different your life is now. So rehabilitative counseling helps in that transition process. And my education of psychology helps me to assist people to make that transition mentally.
Has, your education in psychology helped you?
Of course, I think everybody, everybody can use therapy at some point of time in their life. And just because I have an educational background in psychology doesn't mean that if I'm going through something mental health wise, doesn't mean that I can be my own therapist. But I think it has given me the tools to recognize and be proactive about it when I'm going through something mentally. I had chosen to go to UK to pursue my PhD. Then once I was there, I kind of, through a combination of factors, realized that that's not the path for me. And I started to develop a little bit of seasonal affective disorder, which is because of the weather there. Like, the sun would set at 3 o'clock and then there would be nothing. And it was just cold and dreary. And it was in a small town in the UK. So there would be nothing to do after 3 p.m. I did not have a social circle. And so when I started to recognize those signs of struggle with my mental health, I myself took the initiative to, like, reach out and consult the university counselor and eventually a psychologist, and took on therapy for about 8 to 10 months. My education in psychology has given me those tools to not be ashamed about the fact that we can go through things mental health wise, and to know when to seek intervention. Similarly, in 2023, last year, I had decided that I want to compete at the Asian Para Games, which took place in October last year. So as a para athlete, of course, I have been winning national medals, and I hold the national record in 3 events, the 100, 200 and the long jump. As on date, I hold all 3 of those records. But I always wanted to compete at a big stage before I retire from athletics. So I had made these Asian Games my target, and I eventually did make it to the Asian Para Games team. I competed in China, and when I competed in the Asian Para Games in China, in the track events, I was the oldest athlete from the country. So when I was preparing for this, like the entire year in 2023, I had gone away from home, gone away from everything, and I was just living in a sports hostel and training, so that I would have, like, very little other distractions apart from just training twice a day. So even during that time, I proactively took the step to enroll myself with a sports psychologist who I would speak to once in 10 days during my entire preparation. Because again, my educational background helped me to understand that, of course, physically I am training, that is one part of the game, but it equally matters what your mental state is at the time of competition, and that impacts your performance. So nobody asked me to do it, and there was, in a conventional sense, nothing wrong with me. But I wanted to take that extra, tool in my preparation of consulting with a trained sports psychologist who, helped me to understand the pressures of competition, who gave me the tools like, breath work and visualization. And all these helped me through the entire preparation, through the selection phase, to actually going and performing at such a big stage. And I feel that maybe if I hadn't had my education in psychology, or if I wasn't open to being so accepting of mental health as a major component of my overall well-being, then maybe I would have, shied away from consulting a sports psychologist, because people often feel like if they are consulting anybody related to the mind, then maybe something is wrong with them, maybe they are crazy. So I didn't have these preconceived notions, and therefore I could use that tool.
Extremely precious insights there, Devika. And you rightly said, that a lot of times there is a misconception when people feel the necessity to reach out to somebody, and speak about how they are feeling, and take care of their mental health. So this is going to be extremely insightful for, the listeners and the readers as well. I read somewhere that you and your mum started the sports journey together, and at one point in time also competed. So what sports was it in? Can you give us some insight in?
Right. So in 2006, when my mom started competing, she first started competing in swimming, because even though her legs don't work at all, somehow just with the strength of her arms and her upper body, she's a very good swimmer. And she started competing as a swimmer. And then in 2010 is when she started competing in athletics, para-athletics. So she would do the seated throws, javelin, shot put, and discus. And like I said, I would accompany her to training sessions or training camps. And there I noticed that they have the track events as well. And because I have a lot of hand-eye coordination issues, I cannot, I don't really engage in sports where I need a lot of equipment, because if there is a ball or a shuttle involved, then because of my lack of hand-eye coordination, I am invariably not being able to hit the ball or not being able to hit the shuttle in time. So I kind of realized that running is one sport which doesn't require any equipment. It is just me and my own body. So then I also started competing in the national and state levels. And then, of course, because we were both competing in athletics, from 2010 till 2015, every year when the national para-athletics meet would happen, my mom would compete in her events and I would compete in my events, and it would be in the same tournament. And I don't think there is, to my knowledge, there is no other instance of such a thing where a mother and daughter have competed in the same tournament in disability sports at the same time. And we even went for international tournaments together. In 2015, we went for a para-athletics Grand Prix in the USA in Phoenix, where we both won 2 medals each in our respective events. From 2010 till 2016, we were simultaneously competing in the national and international para-athletics tournaments together. And then, of course, my mom made it to the 2016 Paralympics, and she became the first woman to win a medal at the Paralympics from India. And in 2016, I kind of took a step back from actively participating in sport, because I got a lot more involved with my foundation. And then, of course, like I said, in 2022, I kind of decided once again that I don't want to completely retire before I have, competed at one big stage, at least as an athlete, to complete that journey. And then I made it to the Asian Games, and owing to my performance at the Asian Para Games at the age of 33, where the next closest competitor was at least 10 years younger than me, I overall finished fourth at the Asian Games, but because of that performance, I hold the national record in India in my category of events in the 100, 200 and the long jump.
You've spoken about the entire ecosystem around, when a person is detected with disability and the rehabilitation that kicks in. What do you think, or how do you think that, society can better support individuals with disability? Where do we begin?
I think there are two key aspects to it, and they both are relatively easy to do if we just expand our thought process. One is that of universal design, and the other is to have a more accepting mindset. So when I say universal design, what I mean is that, like, whenever we are constructing a new building or coming up with a new piece of technology, it is not very difficult to do if these things are embedded into the processes, that from the very foundational stage, your building has to be inclusive and accessible for a person with a visual impairment, for a person using a wheelchair. Because the reason why this is called universal design is that, for example, if you construct a ramp, it is not only a person on a wheelchair who will benefit from that, it is also elderly people using walkers. It is also parents carrying their children in strollers. Everybody is going to benefit from that design feature. So it's just smarter and it just makes more sense. And similarly, technology, like any new technology, anything that we are innovating, digital accessibility is a major factor, because now so much is digital. So for speech to text to be available, for any digital piece of technology to be accessible to someone with a hearing or visual impairment, those kind of things. And similarly, when I say that, like, your mindset has to be more accepting, if this is a vicious circle, do we as disabled people come out into society more for people to notice us and accept us, and for it to become the norm? Or does society become accessible first so that we can go somewhere? For example, when my mom used to go to the gym initially in 2000, she would go to the gym, she would show up, and there would be a staircase leading to the gym. So then when she kept showing up for a week, for 10 days, for 20 days, and every time she showed up, 4 people had to carry her wheelchair into the gym. Eventually, after a month, they constructed a ramp, because their mindsets were their mental horizons were broadened, that even this person sitting in this wheelchair can also use this facility. They probably hadn't even thought about that before. So I think, yes, even we as people with various disabilities, little bit somewhere have to take that initiative, that we have to make ourselves more visible and we have to put ourselves out there. But at the same time, universal design is key, and people having a more accepting mindset is key. Like, it is of course changing now, but we still sometimes encounter these mindsets where people will say things like, this is the repercussion of something you may have done in your previous birth, or very, very regressive things like that. So yeah, that we need to do away with that completely, and we have to think of disability in terms of diversity. We are all different in different ways, and this is just one of the ways, like neurodiversity or disability. This is just one of the ways in which people are different from one another.
Beautifully put, Devika. Thank you so much for those insights. Wheeling Happiness Foundation, how did that come through, and where are you all in the journey today?
The seed of that was basically born from the fact that, like I said, sometimes women with the disability especially would reach out to my mom, and they would want to observe her lifestyle. They would want to learn from her how they can be more mobile and more out and about in their disabled bodies, when we would welcome them into our homes. So then my mother and I, we just had this conversation that right now we are able to reach maybe 5 people at a time, 6 people at a time. But if we formalize this into an organization, then our reach to people can be broader. We can reach more number of people. We influence policy to some extent, take advocacy to a higher level, and really impact many more lives. So that's how Wheeling Happiness came about. We are able to support anybody from financially underserved backgrounds. It doesn't have to be only people with disabilities. It can be anybody who called like basically the below poverty line. Like, yeah, so that is the main thing. But of course, because our expertise and understanding lies more in the disability sector, so our focus is more on that, and we do various things through the foundation. We have sponsored education for girls with disabilities. We have assisted and guided many people with disabilities to take up sport. We do a lot of advocacy, like I, through the foundation, and like, working in this field for so many years. My mother is, of course, an exceptional motivational speaker, so she gets invited to various panels, and similarly, I started to get invited to various kind of expert panels and boards. So I also ended up becoming one of the founding members for the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network, which is a network for the entire Commonwealth countries, where we highlight the concerns of young people with disabilities and ensuring that young people with disabilities are included in decision-making processes, are given a voice in leadership roles within these organizational structures. And then we do events like before COVID, the pandemic, we did a national pageant for deaf girls and boys from all over the country, because there is a Miss and Mr. Deaf World pageant that happens every year. So in order to select people from India to represent India at that pageant, we conducted a national level pageant in 2020. And then for the last 3 years, we have been conducting Kabaddi championships every year for athletes with physical impairments. So yeah, we do these different kind of events, even small things like donating wheelchairs, which is a huge contributor to a person with disability in terms of their basic mobility. Like, I have met people who have been sitting on their beds just in a tiny room for 10 years because they cannot afford a wheelchair that costs 12,000 rupees. So every month we are donating 10, 15, 20 wheelchairs that are going all over the country. So that is one thing that I am very proud of, that our work spans pan India. And during COVID, for example, we adopted 90 families of people with disabilities across Jammu, Kashmir, and even Amethi. So the criteria was that these families, their primary breadwinners were out of jobs because they were like auto rickshaw drivers or things like that, vocations that were not making money during the pandemic, and they had at least one member in the family who was a member with disability. So of course that comes with additional costs, because then, like for example, you have to buy medical supplies, you have to buy adult diapers, things like that. So for a year, we adopted these 90 families, and we were taking care of all of their overhead expenses as well as providing rations to them. So these are the various things that we do, and through the various recognitions that we have received, like for example, I won the Queen's Young Leader Award in 2015, which was at Buckingham Palace. So that gave me access to resources, which one of the resources was a leadership program, year-long leadership program from Cambridge University. Through that, I got connected to the Commonwealth Council, and through the Commonwealth Council, now I have been working with the Commonwealth Youth Networks. So they meet once every 2 years, all the Commonwealth leaders, and discuss common goals and policies for all the Commonwealth countries. So we ensure that people with disability, especially young people with disability, are part of that agenda, and they are included in those goals for the future of the Commonwealth. Because going back to it, like I always say that, it's not just a charity case. It is something that makes business sense. If 15% of the world is people with disabilities, and research says that there is like $8 trillion of spending power that the families of disabled people have, which is not going into the world's GDP, because service providers and product designers are not catering to this population. So of course, if you include this 15% of the world means 1 billion people. So if you include these 1 billion people in your target audience when you're designing a product or providing a service, or even when you are hiring or making hiring policy decisions, if you include us not as charity cases, but if you think of us as productive citizens of the world, and if you think of people with disabilities in a way that, okay, if I make certain adjustments, if I give you certain reasonable accommodations, you can actually contribute to the economy, you can actually add to the GDP. I think that is a better way to think about it.
What are the common myths that you may have come across that lead people to think that people with disability cannot be contributing members to either the society, the corporate, etc.?
I think it is just a general lack of exposure, like I said. So I think now a lot of corporates are also changing this, like they are consciously hiring or at least designing ways to hire more people with disabilities, and several companies consult with us on this as well. So another thing I tell them is that if the education pipeline is not strong enough, you are open, let's say you are open to hiring a person with disability, but your requirement remains that it's okay if you're sitting on a wheelchair, but you must have an MBA. But if this person with disability has been turned away from schooling, has been turned away from college, because you get admission in a college and they tell you, you can come to college, but if the class is on the second floor, we cannot help. So if that education pipeline is not there, then how are you going to have people who are ready for this job that you are offering? So it is not just a matter of providing jobs. It is a whole pipeline issue. From very much basic primary education onwards, we need to be more inclusive. And if you talk about the misconceptions, yes, 10 years back, 12 years back, when corporate started on this journey of, opening up to the idea of hiring more people with disabilities, one of the questions that we received was that, but I don't want to come across as if I am being discriminative against them because of their disability. This was one of the apprehensions, that we don't want to come across as being politically incorrect, or we don't want to come across as though we are discriminating against a person with disability if we are trying to reprimand them on their performance just like we would do with anyone else. Or even small things like somebody, like for example, if my mom is sitting on a wheelchair, again, maybe because people are not exposed to people with different abilities in their life, the moment they notice some sort of impairment, like a person is carrying a walking stick or sitting on a wheelchair, automatically what they'll do is they'll start talking in a louder voice, like in a slow, loud voice, assuming that the person is incapable of understanding them, or they will talk to the person who is accompanying that person rather than addressing them directly. This kind of assumption around the intellect of a person with disability, of course, neurodiversity does exist, but just because somebody is sitting on a wheelchair, or just because somebody has a visual impairment, doesn't automatically mean something about their IQ or their intellect, right? These are the misconceptions that people have, and I am very optimistic, and I do see that things are changing around disability inclusion, and more government and private organizations are now taking the initiative to be more inclusive. But what needs to be done in this case is that there has to be more involvement of the end user. Like, for example, if you are designing a building to be disabled friendly, or if you're designing a sports facility to be friendly for parasports persons, you need to involve people with different disabilities in the design process, in the user process, to make sure that you are designing it in a way that it will actually be accessible and useful for them.
A person with disability, who, let's just say, hasn't moved from wherever they are, what would your advice to a person like this be? Where do they begin? Where do they begin their journey?
So this is like, for example, in the way that we work, a lot of organizations, what they do is like they set up hostels or places, vocational centers where people with disability come and they live there together, and they learn certain skills and vocations and develop a community there. But then eventually they have to go back home. So what we try to do is that if I am providing some sort of equipment or access or anything to a person with disability, we try to do it within their existing communities, because at the end of the day, in the long term, that is where they have to live and thrive. So if it is in a small village in Haryana somewhere, like for example, we conducted year-long disability awareness drive in various districts in Haryana. The sarpanch of that particular area would have the details of all the people with disabilities in that area. So we would invite all of them along with their caregivers, make them understand certain paperwork and government schemes that they can make use of for people with disabilities, and also listen to their concerns. For example, if there is no ramp where they live, or if there isn't an accessible toilet where they live, or they don't have a wheelchair that can move around in the rugged, environment where they live. So we try to go into those communities and make that community itself more accessible for those people. If constructing a small ramp within their household, or ensuring that the pathway from their house to their nearest, community center, wherever the entire community gets together in the evenings, that is accessible. That is the only way to ensure long-term integration and inclusion of those people within their communities. So I think that is what my advice would be, that in whatever small way you can, it's better to modify your existing environment, because I've had a lifetime of moving from place to place, but most people don't live like that, right? Most people live a majority of their life in their hometown. So wherever you live, if that place becomes more accessible for you, then you can develop a better sense of community and support from your local community. Because, for example, when I donate a wheelchair to someone and I create a small ramp in their household and make the washroom in their house a little more accessible, many a times that person is able to get out of their house and meet other community members and just have a chat about general day-to-day stuff for the first time in years. And that very sense of community is also very important to the well-being of a person. Similarly, there was a girl who reached out to me because she was very young when she had an accident. Very young, almost 8 months old when she had an accident. And her older sister was just 1 year older. So her mother was a primary school teacher till 5th standard. She would, take both her daughters to the same school, and she would be there with them as a teacher the whole day. But 6th standard onwards, no school gave her admission because they were in a small village and the schools did not want to take responsibility. So you would study from her elder sister's books, and she gave her 10th standard examination through open schooling. After that, she reached out to me. She found me through Instagram and she said, I want to study. Then for her 12th standard, I did a background check and assigned a home tutor to her through my foundation, who was going home to her every day in her village and teaching her, after which she cleared her 12th boards again from open schooling. So essentially, she was getting the education, she was getting the certification. But when it came to college, I wanted to ensure that she goes to an actual physical college, because other than your degree, there is a lot that, being educated in a hostel environment or a school environment gives you. It gives you social skills, it gives you friendships, it gives you a sense of belonging. And all of those things are very important from an emotional well-being perspective for a human being to thrive. So then we sponsored her graduation from a private university which was wheelchair accessible. And so even till date, when I see her on social media, when she's tagging her friends and wishing them happy birthday, for so many years, from 5th standard to 12th standard, for so many years in her young life, she did not have that sense of community. She only ever interacted with her sister and mother. For her to form those friendships and those community bonds and to thrive as a social animal, that's what we are as human beings, that is very important.
Of course, I understand, the example that you gave was, again, a very, very young girl who reached out to you, but kids who are listening to you, and let's just say are confined to their homes or whatever reasons. For example, in your case, you said your mom was a constant source of support, your parents rather, or your family together. For them, because maybe their parents don't know any better, how do they begin that conversation for themselves?
I think in today's time, most of us have access to at least, WhatsApp on our phones, to YouTube on our phones, and we spend a lot of time on maybe Instagram or TikTok or whatever it is. So for anybody who even has that basic level of access, look for the right things on the internet, look for what interests you, and mainly don't limit your hopes, expectations, and dreams from yourself on the basis of your disability or your limitation. Don't assume from the get-go that even if something has sparked your interest a little bit, don't let it go because you assume that you will not be able to do it because of your disability or your limitation. There are very few things in the world today that you cannot do on the basis of your disability. So I think if, of course, somebody is listening to this podcast, I'm sure they are using the internet. So use the internet to your advantage. Look for example, if somebody is interested in sports, they can just Google the term wheelchair sports or disability sports or para sports, and so much information is going to come up, and then, one thing is going to lead to the other. So the internet is what connects us today. The internet is it is the source of endless information, and if we look for the right things, if we look for how we can make our life better, the internet is going to provide us with a lot of solutions. Most of my beneficiaries who reach out to me, whether they are younger kids or whether they are young adults, they find me through the internet, and then they end up becoming community volunteers. If I have donated a wheelchair to one person, that one person has connected me to 15, 20 other more people in need who need a wheelchair, who need some sort of counseling support. So they end up becoming our community volunteers. So I think as a person with any kind of limitation or disability, if you have access to the internet, if you have access to books, look for the things that can empower you. And I think I can give a very good example here of two very starkly different personalities that we have met in our work. It always stands out to me. I met one lady during one of our these community outreach programs who had a disability, acquired a disability, and she was a wheelchair user for about 10 years at the point when we met her. And in order to better understand her condition, we asked her, do you mind explaining the nature of your disability? And just hearing that question and just even trying to talk about it, she burst into tears, which meant that even 1 decade on, she had not been able to accept what had happened to her. And a complete contrast to that, we met a young girl in a hospital because we were visiting a city and somebody told us that, I really want you to meet this girl. So we went to meet her in the hospital. She had just been in an accident 10 days prior, and she had one of her legs amputated. And she is still recovering from that surgery. It's just 10 days old, and she is a 12th grader. So her spirits were so high, and she was more concerned that, I hope I will be able to give my board exams. And the way she was interacting, the way she was talking to us, she was asking us, okay, this leg is gone now. How do I get a new one? How do prosthetics work? When can I get my prosthetic? How do I heal so that I can get my prosthetic as soon as possible? And what do I need to do to make sure that I don't have to skip my 12th exams? So her outlook, the outlook of these two people, that shows you the difference between being accepting of your own circumstances and moving forward. Basically, like having that zeal to move forward in life. That is the source of everything. Like, if you don't have that zeal to move forward and make something of your life, then there are many excuses that you can find, that I don't have resources, I don't have information. But if you have that basic zeal to make something of your life, then you will find all the excuses and all the resources to lead you in that direction. That is how people find us. That's how they reach out to us.
I'm sure whosoever is, listening to this podcast, or maybe, reading this particular interview, is going to be, absolutely be inspired and be benefited by this. I will ensure that I am tagging, the website wherever we have the interviews that's ready to be published.
Definitely. My Instagram handles, even my phone number is readily available online. Like, I get calls from unknown numbers all the time, and I always answer because I know that it could be someone looking for some sort of assistance.
When I reached out to you, I knew you were accessible, but, I think you made it very, very easy for people to, reach out to you, not even in terms of, of course, looking out for certain physical assistance and help and rehabilitation, but also the mental aspect that you highlighted. I think I've had a fantastic time, hearing from you, Devika. This is all wraps for me. This wraps up the conversation with Devika Malik. She has shed light on the personal and societal challenges faced by individuals with disabilities, and her work with the Feeling Happiness Foundation exemplifies the positive impact of empowerment and support. It is clear that fostering an inclusive society requires both understanding and action. By creating an inclusive environment for this 15% population, not as charity cases, but as opportunities to be productive citizens, can unlock immense economic and social benefits. By breaking down misconceptions and advocating for practical changes, we can create a world where everyone, regardless of their abilities, can thrive and contribute meaningfully. Let's continue to challenge assumptions, embrace diversity, and work towards a more inclusive future for all. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the Human Collapse YouTube channel and the various social media platforms mentioned in the description below. By sharing this episode with your friends and family, you help to foster a community where strength and compassion thrive.